That night didn't begin with fear. That part matters. It began the way most nights did back then, without intention. Just a series of habits carried out on autopilot, the kind you don't remember afterward unless something forces you to. I got home later than usual. Not late enough to raise concern, just late enough to leave me drained. The rain had already started by the time I stepped inside. Not heavy rain. The kind that doesn't announce itself, it just stays. I kicked my shoes off by the door and stood there longer than necessary, listening to the sound of water against the building. The hallway lights flickered once, then steadied. I didn't think anything of it. They'd been doing that for months. The apartment smelled faintly like dust and clean fabric. Nothing sharp, nothing unpleasant. Just the neutral smell of a place that hadn't been occupied long enough to feel lived in, but long enough to feel familiar. I checked my phone while walking toward the bedroom. 12% battery. I remember that number because I considered plugging it in, then decided against it. The charger was across the room, and I told myself I wouldn't be on it long anyway. That decision stayed with me. I changed clothes without turning on the overhead light. Just the small lamp on the nightstand, casting a soft circle across the bed and part of the wall. Everything else stayed in shadow. I preferred it that way. Less stimulation. Easier to rest. Outside, the rain tapped against the window in uneven rhythms. Not loud enough to block sound completely, but steady enough to soften the edges of the room. It blurred the city lights into streaks of white and orange, sliding slowly down the glass. I set my phone on the bedside table, face up, watching the screen dim as the clock shifted to 2:17 a.m. That time stuck with me later, too. The apartment felt quieter than usual, not silent, just stripped down. No neighbors moving around, no doors closing somewhere else in the building. Even the hum of traffic outside felt distant, like it had been pushed farther away. Silence like that doesn't announce itself. You only notice it once it's already settled in. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The paint had a faint crack running near the corner. I'd noticed it the first week I moved in and then forgotten about it completely. That night, my eyes followed it without meaning to, tracing it from one end to the other. Exhaustion pressed down on me slowly. Not the kind that knocks you out, but the kind that dulls everything, makes thoughts feel heavier, makes time stretch. I reached over and turned the lamp off. The room went dark, except for the faint glow from the window. I listened to the rain. I always did. It was easier than listening to my own thoughts. Living alone had been my idea. I'd told people it was about independence, about needing my own space. That was partly true. But the real reason was quieter. I didn't like the feeling of being observed. I liked knowing that if something moved in the apartment, it was because I moved it. Most nights, that certainty was comforting. That night, it felt thin. I rolled onto my side, facing the wall, pulling the blanket up slightly. The bed sheets were cool, clean, ordinary. Everything about the room felt normal enough that I stopped paying attention to it. That's when loneliness tends to surface. Not as a feeling, but as an absence. No one else breathing. No one else shifting weight. No one else turning over in the dark. Just you and the room. I let the rain fill that space. I remember thinking, briefly, about how easy it would be to disappear into a routine like this. Work, home, sleep, repeat. Days passing without leaving a mark. That thought didn't scare me. It felt distant, abstract. I checked my phone one last time. Still 12%. No messages, no missed calls. I set it back down and closed my eyes. For a moment, everything lined up the way it was supposed to. The rain, the darkness, the quiet. And then something about the quiet felt wrong, not because of a sound. Because of how aware I suddenly was of it. It felt closer than before. Like the room had pulled inward, tightening around the bed. I shifted slightly, adjusting my position, trying to get comfortable again. That's when I realized I hadn't checked the door yet. I always checked the door. The thought arrived fully formed, bringing with it a small spike of irritation. I told myself I was overthinking. I'd locked it earlier. I always did. Still, I opened my eyes. The room looked unchanged. The doorway to the hallway was a dark rectangle against darker walls. The rain continued its steady pattern outside. I sat up and swung my legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cold beneath my feet. I stood there for a second, listening, then walked down the short hallway toward the front door. My footsteps sounded louder than they should have, each one distinct, echoing slightly in the narrow space. The door stood exactly where it always did. I reached out and turned the lock. It didn't move. Locked. I tested it anyway, pressing my shoulder lightly against the door. Solid. Secure. That familiar sense of reassurance settled in. I stood there a moment longer than necessary, hand still on the lock, letting the feeling linger. Then I turned around and walked back toward the bedroom. As I passed through the kitchen, I glanced toward the counter. Everything was in its place. No dishes, no clutter, just empty surfaces reflecting faint light from outside. Shadows rested in the corners of the room where the overhead light didn't reach. They didn't move. They didn't stretch. They simply existed, the way shadows always do. I went back to bed. This time, when I lay down, I stayed on my back, staring up at the ceiling again. I listened to the rain and matched my breathing to it, letting the rhythm guide me toward sleep. The silence returned to its earlier shape. And for a while, that was all there was. Just a tired person, in a small apartment, on a rainy night. Nothing else. Nothing yet. For a while, nothing changed. The rain continued at the same pace, not heavier, not lighter, just steady enough to blur the edges of thought. My breathing slowed without effort, the way it does when the body starts letting go before the mind does. I remember thinking that this was the moment sleep usually took over, that familiar slide, where sounds stretch, then soften, then lose meaning. I don't know how much time passed, minutes maybe, enough for my muscles to loosen, enough for my thoughts to stop following each other in straight lines. That's when I heard it. At first, I didn't recognize it as a sound that belonged to the room. It slipped in under the rain, almost perfectly timed with it. A single dull contact. Soft enough that it could have been dismissed as part of the building settling. Almost. I stayed still and listened. There it was again. One step. Not a shuffle, not a creak. A step. It came from above me. Not directly overhead, slightly to the left, where the hallway ran parallel to the bedroom. The sound was faint but specific. The kind of sound you only notice if you're familiar with how a place normally behaves. I waited for the next one. Nothing. The rain filled the gap immediately, as if it had been waiting for the chance. I told myself it was a neighbor, someone moving around upstairs. Someone awake at the same hour for reasons that had nothing to do with me. That explanation fit easily, too easily. The building was old, sound traveled. Footsteps carried through walls in strange ways. I turned my head slightly on the pillow, angling my ear toward the ceiling. Listened again. Another step. This one was farther away. Then silence. I lay there, counting quietly. 1 breath. 2. 3. No follow-up sound. That's when I noticed something subtle, something that didn't register right away. The footsteps didn't sound like they were above me anymore. They sounded closer. Not louder, closer. As if the distance between us had changed, even though nothing else had. I tensed slightly, just enough to bring myself fully awake. The rain continued without interruption. The ceiling above me remained unchanged. No shadows moved. No light shifted. I waited for the sound to repeat. It didn't. That was the part that unsettled me most. Buildings don't usually stop mid-pattern. If someone is walking, there's a rhythm to it. Weight transfers. Momentum carries through. This sound didn't follow a rhythm. It happened. Then it stopped. I lay there longer than was comfortable, listening to the rain fill every space where the sound should have been. Eventually, I rolled onto my side again and closed my eyes. I told myself I'd imagined it. That explanation felt thinner now, but it was still available, and I took it. Sleep didn't come as easily the second time. I must have drifted off eventually because the next thing I remember is light. Not daylight, not a lamp. The soft, sudden glow of my phone screen. It illuminated the edge of the bed, the wall beside it, and part of my hand where it rested on the blanket. For a second, I didn't move. I stared at the light without fully understanding why it was there. Then my mind caught up. I hadn't touched the phone. I reached for it slowly, careful not to jostle the bed. The screen showed a notification banner across the top. No name, no icon. Just a blank bar where information should have been. I frowned, thumb hovering over the screen. That wasn't normal. I tapped it. The screen unlocked. The notification disappeared. No message, no alert history, no missed call, nothing. The home screen stared back at me like it always did. I scrolled, checked my apps, checked my messages. Still nothing. The phone's battery now read 11%. I sat up slightly, resting against the headboard, the screen lighting my face. The room beyond it remained dark and unchanged. I waited for another notification. None came. I told myself it was a glitch. Phones do that sometimes. Ghost notifications. Background processes waking the screen for no clear reason. It had happened before. Rarely, but not never. Still, I checked the time. 2:19 a.m. 2 minutes had passed since the last time I remembered looking. I locked the phone and placed it back on the nightstand, face down this time. The light vanished. The darkness returned to its previous shape. I lay back and stared at the ceiling again, rain tracing the same patterns outside. I focused on that sound, forcing my attention onto it, letting it pull me away from the room. Seconds passed. Then, very softly, I heard something move. Not above me this time. Inside the apartment. It wasn't a step. It wasn't a scrape. It was the faint sound of weight shifting, somewhere beyond the bedroom door. I didn't sit up. I didn't call out. I didn't reach for the phone again. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped the moment I focused on it. The silence that followed felt deliberate, like whatever had made the sound was waiting to see what I would do next. The rain continued, steady and unchanged, masking everything else. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was exhausted. I told myself that if I stayed still long enough, the room would return to normal. Eventually, my breathing slowed again. The tension in my shoulders eased. And just as I began to drift, my phone lit up. This time there was no notification, just the screen, bright, unprompted, as if something wanted me awake. I stared at it, heart beating louder than the rain now. And for the first time that night, a clear thought formed and refused to leave. Whatever was happening wasn't finished. It was just getting closer. By the time the phone screen finally went dark again, I had stopped trying to understand what was happening. Understanding felt like the wrong goal. All I wanted was for the apartment to return to the way it had been before. Quiet, predictable, empty. I lay there on my back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain reclaim the room. It pressed in gently, like static filling a dead channel. For a while it worked. My heartbeat slowed. My breathing evened out. I remember thinking that whatever had happened had passed. That was my mistake. The sound started as something I almost ignored. A faint, dragging noise, barely distinct from the rain. It came from the wall to my right, the one that separated the bedroom from the neighboring apartment. At first it sounded like water, like a pipe reacting to pressure, like moisture moving somewhere it shouldn't. I told myself that explanation immediately. Didn't even question it. Old buildings make noise when it rains. Anyone who's lived in one knows that. The sound continued. Slow. Uneven. It reminded me of fingernails moving across fabric. Not sharp, not fast, just persistent. I shifted slightly on the bed, trying to find a position where I couldn't hear it as clearly. The sound followed no pattern. It didn't repeat at regular intervals. It stopped for several seconds at a time, then returned in short bursts. Each time it came back, it felt closer to the surface of the wall. I sat up. The noise stopped. Immediately. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt like a response. I swung my legs off the bed and stood, listening. The wall was quiet now. The rain continued outside, unchanged. I walked to the light switch and flipped it on. The room filled with warm light. The wall looked normal. No marks, no stains, no signs of damage. I pressed my palm against it, half expecting to feel movement on the other side. Nothing. The silence held. I waited another minute, then turned the light off. The darkness returned. So did the sound. Louder this time. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough that I couldn't pretend it wasn't there. The dragging motion moved along the wall slowly, as if tracing the outline of the room. I turned the light back on. Silence. I stood there longer this time, hand still on the switch, trying to decide what that meant. Eventually, I turned the light off again. The sound came back almost immediately, and this time, it didn't come from the wall. It came from above the ceiling. I didn't go back to bed. I stayed standing in the middle of the bedroom, listening as the sound shifted locations without warning. Ceiling, wall, then nothing at all. I told myself I needed air. That moving would break whatever pattern had started. I stepped into the hallway. The apartment felt different now. Not darker. Not colder. Just altered in a way I couldn't describe clearly enough to argue against. That's when I saw the door. The front door wasn't open. But it wasn't closed the way I remembered it either. The handle sat at a slightly different angle. I stared at it for a long time before moving closer. The deadbolt was unlocked. I know it was unlocked. I stood there with my hand on it, turning it back and forth, trying to force my memory to correct itself. I had checked that lock. I was certain of it. I checked the door frame next. No marks, no scratches, no sign that it had been forced. I opened the door slowly and looked out into the hallway. Empty. The lights overhead hummed quietly. The carpet was undisturbed. No shadows moved at the end of the corridor. I closed the door and locked it again, then checked it twice. I didn't stop there. I walked through the apartment methodically, checking every room, bathroom, closet, kitchen, living room. Nothing had changed. Everything was exactly where it should be. That was the problem. If someone had been there, I wanted proof. Something displaced, something wrong enough that I wouldn't have to guess. The apartment refused to give me that. I stood in the hallway listening. Nothing. The rain outside felt farther away now, like it was happening somewhere else entirely. I went back to the bedroom eventually. I don't remember deciding to. I just remember being there again, sitting on the edge of the bed, lights off. That's when I heard the breathing. Behind me. Slow. Controlled. I didn't turn around. I didn't freeze either. I stayed exactly the way I was and listened, counting the seconds between breaths. The sound stopped when I became aware of it. I waited. Then it started again. Closer. So close that I could hear the shape of it. The way air moved through a mouth. The slight pause between inhale and exhale. The rain faded into the background, no longer loud enough to cover it. I turned around. The room was empty. The breathing stopped the moment I faced it. I stood up, heart pounding now, and backed toward the wall, eyes scanning the corners of the room. Nothing moved. I told myself this was exhaustion, that I had crossed some invisible line where the body keeps going even when the mind has started to shut down. I took a step forward. The breathing returned. Right behind me. I didn't turn around this time. I couldn't. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed, lights on, rain barely audible now. I tried to ground myself, listed things I could see, things I could touch, things I could hear. The list felt incomplete. Memories started surfacing without invitation. Childhood nights. Lying awake, convinced something was standing just outside my door. The certainty that if I opened my eyes, I'd see it. I hadn't thought about that fear in years. It felt strange to feel it again so clearly. I checked my phone. Low battery. No notifications. That's when the whisper came back. Not my name this time. A sentence. Spoken calmly, clearly, close enough that I felt it rather than heard it. It said it had been waiting. I didn't stay in the apartment after that. But even now, years later, I still think about the way it said it. Not as a threat, not as a warning, just as a fact. If you heard breathing behind you right now, would you turn around or pretend you didn't? The rain continued, steady and patient, filling the space where answers should have been. And whatever had been there with me that night, it didn't sound disappointed, just relieved. By the time the rain stopped, I had been awake for hours. I know this because when it finally went quiet, the absence of it felt heavier than any sound that had come before. Rain had been the constant reference point all night. Its rhythm, its cover, its reassurance that the world outside was still moving. When it ended, the apartment felt sealed. I noticed the silence before I noticed anything else. It pressed in from every direction at once, like the air itself had settled. No traffic, no distant hum, no water on glass, just stillness. I stood in the middle of the bedroom listening. Nothing answered. That's when I started to see the changes. They weren't obvious, not the kind of things you'd notice if you were walking into a room for the first time. They only stood out because I knew how the space was supposed to look. The chair by the desk wasn't pushed in all the way. Not much. Just a few inches farther back than I remembered. At first, I told myself I'd moved it earlier, that I'd leaned on it without thinking. But the explanation didn't settle the way it should have. It stayed loose in my head, like it hadn't found anything solid to attach to. I walked into the living room. The couch pillows were uneven, not thrown, not disturbed, just adjusted. The kind of adjustment someone makes when they sit somewhere briefly, when they shift their weight and stand again without fixing what they've changed. I stood there staring at them, trying to remember the last time I'd been in that room. Trying to remember if I'd sat there that night. I couldn't. I moved slowly now. Carefully. Every step measured, as if the apartment might react if I wasn't deliberate enough. The kitchen was next. Nothing broken, nothing missing. But the glass I'd left in the sink was dry. I picked it up and turned it slightly in my hand, watching how the light caught the rim. Dry. I set it back down. My reflection stared at me from the microwave door. Pale. Tired. Familiar. I turned toward the bathroom. The mirror there caught me mid-step. I stopped. The reflection didn't. Not immediately. It followed me a moment later, just slightly out of sync. So subtle that I almost missed it. A fraction of a second. A delay so small it felt unreasonable to question it. I stepped back. The reflection did the same. This time, it lagged again. I leaned closer to the glass, watching my own face for signs of distortion. The mirror showed me exactly as I was. No warping, no change in shape, just timing. I raised my hand. The reflection followed. Late, I backed away from the sink. The reflection stayed where it was for half a second longer than it should have. Then it caught up. I didn't touch the mirror again. I left the bathroom and walked back into the hallway, heart beating steadily now, no longer fast. Something about the space had settled into a shape I couldn't argue with anymore. This wasn't about sounds. It wasn't about exhaustion. It was about presence. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It surfaced the way memories do when you're trying not to remember something specific. Small moments resurfaced. The breathing that didn't react to me. The footsteps without rhythm. The sound that stopped when I listened. The voice that didn't sound surprised when I heard it. I thought about the way the apartment had always felt slightly full, even when I first moved in. How I'd written it off as adjustment, as acoustics, as loneliness, exaggerating empty space. I thought about how easily I'd accepted that I was alone without ever proving it. I went back to the front door, checked the lock again. Still secure, no signs of entry. That's when it became clear. Nothing had come in, nothing had needed to. I stood there, hand resting on the door frame, and understood something without putting it into words. I hadn't been sharing the apartment with something that arrived. I had been sharing it with something that stayed. The rain hadn't stopped outside. It had only stopped being there for me. I noticed then how quiet the building felt. Not late-night quiet. Not early morning quiet. Closed quiet. Like a place after everyone has gone home. I walked back toward the bedroom, passing through the living room again. The chair by the desk was pushed in now. I hadn't touched it. I didn't stop walking. The hallway felt longer than before. The walls seemed farther apart, the ceiling higher. The space between rooms stretched subtly, enough to feel but not enough to measure. I reached the bedroom doorway and paused. The bed was disturbed, not messy, occupied. The sheets were pressed down slightly on the far side, as if someone had just stood up from sitting there. I didn't step inside. I didn't speak. I didn't ask questions that would have required answers. I already had what I needed. The voice returned then. Not whispered, not close, not far. It didn't come from one direction at all. It came from the apartment. It said my name the way someone does when they've said it many times before, casually, without emphasis, without urgency. I realized then that it had always known when I was awake, and when I wasn't. I remembered how easily I slept here once, how quickly my body relaxed, how natural it felt to close my eyes. How often I dreamed without remembering the dreams themselves. How often I woke up feeling like I hadn't been alone. The understanding settled fully at last. I hadn't been hearing things. I had been responding, sometimes out loud, sometimes without sound. The apartment had learned my patterns, and I had learned its silence. The lights flickered once, then steadied. The hallway stretched farther than it should have. The bedroom door stood open, waiting. And somewhere in the space behind me, where no one should have been standing, weight shifted carefully on the floor. Not to approach, not to retreat, just to remind me. I had never lived there by myself, and I never would have. I didn't stay in the apartment until morning. That part surprises people when I tell them later. They expect panic. They expect urgency. They expect me to have run. I didn't. I left calmly, slowly. I gathered only what I needed. Phone, wallet, keys. I didn't turn the lights off when I went. I didn't check the rooms again. I already knew what I would or wouldn't find. The hallway outside my door looked the same as it always had. Long, narrow, dimly lit. The carpet muffled my steps the way it always had, and that familiarity felt wrong now, like the building was trying to convince me nothing had happened. I didn't look back. I stayed with a friend that night. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't tell anyone everything. I slept on their couch and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else's home settling around me. Sleep came in fragments. Every time I drifted, I felt like I was being called back, not by sound, by attention. In the days that followed, I returned to the apartment only once, not to live there, just to make things official. The landlord met me in the afternoon. Daylight filled the rooms easily then, washing away the shadows that had felt permanent the night before. Everything looked harmless again, clean, empty, too empty. I explained that I'd be moving out early. I gave a reason that didn't invite questions. He nodded the way people do when they've heard many reasons and don't care to sort through them. Before I left, I asked him something. I asked how long the apartment had been vacant before I moved in. He checked his records, told me the date. It was longer than I expected. I asked if anyone had lived there with me, a previous tenant who hadn't updated paperwork, a maintenance worker, anyone. He shook his head. No. I asked if there had ever been complaints, noise, disturbances, anything like that. He paused for just a moment longer than necessary. Then he said no. I thanked him and turned to leave. That's when he added something, almost as an afterthought. He said the unit had always been quiet, that most people didn't stay long. I didn't ask him to explain. I already understood. Later, there was a report. Not the kind you see on the news, just a record. Dates, statements, notes that reduced everything to neutral language, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of another person, no reason to believe I hadn't been alone. The apartment was listed as empty again. That word stayed with me. Empty. Because emptiness implies absence. And what I experienced was never absent. I moved into a different place after that. Different layout, different building, different sounds. I made sure of it. I avoided routines. I slept with lights on sometimes, with music playing, with the window cracked open even when it rained. It helped. For a while. Rain still does what it always has. It softens edges, It fills space. It makes rooms feel smaller and safer than they really are. On quiet nights, I let it play softly in the background while I try to sleep. Not to remember, to forget. But there are moments, right before sleep takes me, when everything goes still again. The rain fades into something distant. The room settles. The air feels full. And then I hear it. Not loudly, not clearly, just enough. My name. Spoken the way someone does when they're close enough not to need volume. The way someone does when they know you'll hear them anyway. I don't answer. I never turn around. I let the sound pass and wait for sleep to come. Because they said the apartment was empty when I moved in. So I still don't understand. Why someone whispers my name every time you fall asleep.